The more you work with Excel, the more likely you are to encounter longer formulas, like the one we're seeing in cell F2 on the debug formula sheet here. Now, you may even have seen longer formulas than this, but here's what happens sometimes. You're not getting the answer you expected. Maybe you are familiar with this data, and yet this formula right here isn't giving you the answers you want. I have a habit of zooming in on cells where I want to make editing changes, and then double-clicking. You certainly can do this in the formula bar if you're comfortable with it, but by double-clicking in a cell, as I'm doing here, particularly if you have zoomed in, this is larger and clearer and easier to see, and the color coding helps as well. Now, here's a technique that's going to be really useful at times. Let's suppose that a portion of this formula, you want to know the answer before actually seeing the entire answer. In other words, what does this evaluate to? So I'm going to be highlighting just these cells here and press F9. And while editing, F9 allows us to explore interim results or a portion of this. Now, maybe as I look at that, I say, well, I don't think that's going to be the problem. Maybe it's the sum of these two that somehow is at issue. I'm going to highlight these two and press F9. Well, maybe that's helpful, maybe not. The point is you can do this in pieces or in chunks. Is it this product here maybe that's part of the problem? I'm going to highlight that and press F9. Now, it's important when you do this, recognize sometimes maybe that light bulb just hasn't gone off. You haven't figured out what's wrong. But if you press enter, it's as if you've altered the formula to look like this. So you don't want to be doing that. And if you do, of course, press Control Z to undo it. So many times what you'll do here is press escape. Now, when you're doing this editing and you do recognize that something is wrong, maybe, for example, it was this product here, or maybe this whole portion of it right here. Be sure that what you highlight by itself could stand alone as a viable formula. Now, if I were to highlight this and press F9, you get a message that's completely misleading and not helpful at all. This really isn't an error. It's just that what I highlighted by itself would not be a coherent formula. So I want to just close this and start over again and maybe highlight this. In other words, that by itself with the equal sign would be a viable formula. So I'll press F9. And if that's helpful, I say, oh yeah, I have to refer to another cell. I'm just going to hit escape here and maybe re-edit again. And maybe that should have been an E17 or an E16 or something like that. In other words, use it as you need it, and you can get those interim results that are going to be helpful to figure out certain kinds of formulas. By the way, there's also a technique in Excel called Evaluate Formula. You'll find it on the Formulas tab. You might want to take a look at this. Now, I don't prefer this one, although I think it has some merit too. This shows you the formula in a different way and allows you to evaluate it from left to right. So if I press Evaluate now, it'll show me what the E17 is actually equal to. And now it moves over and highlights the E18. I'll press Evaluate. Now, we can certainly do this with the F9 key. But to me, with the F9 key, you've got more flexibility to highlight the portion of this that you want to see rather than doing this in a left to right order. So I'm simply going to close this and ignore it. So I've seen a method of doing this with the F9 key that I think is more valuable. Now, here's another kind of a formula here. I'm going to scroll over to display it better. And even if you don't know anything about the if function, which we cover later in this course, if you happen to see a formula like this, I'm double clicking, I think you want to throw up your hands and possibly give up or start over or something. Now, maybe you were the one that wrote this, so maybe you've got some insight into it. It's been a while since you looked at it. If someone else wrote it, usually it's going to take a bit longer. But what might we do to figure out whether this is working properly? A formatting technique that you might be familiar with if you're putting in titles is that while typing titles, when you press Alt-Enter, you introduce a line break into a cell. Now here we've got a long formula. What if we were to have line breaks here in front of the ifs? So here's an if right here, the second one. I'm going to click right in front of it after that comma there and press Alt-Enter. I'm going to do this right before the next if, and before the next one, and before this last one, and maybe even in front of the first one there, right after the equal sign. Alt-Enter. That simply introduces a line break. Now, this does not change the content of the formula at all, but it simply is going to give us the same result. However, it is easier to read. I think you've got a much better chance of figuring out whether this logic is working properly. Should this formula be rewritten? Well, based on the data at hand, perhaps. When that's not the situation here that we're trying to really focus on. It's the idea that by restructuring a formula, by pressing Alt-Enter wherever you wish, you can view this in a more coherent way. And finally, just press Enter. Now, when you click back on the cell, you might be a little surprised to see nothing in the formula bar. If you double-click here, you'll see the whole formula. But something else you can do as well to see this, you can expand the formula bar in a couple different ways. You can simply put the mouse on its lower border and drag downward. You could do it that way. If you press Control-Shift-U, it will also expand the formula bar. It might not expand it to the depth that you wish, so on the right-hand side, you'll see arrows over there. You could explore the function this way. You also see a double set of arrows on the right. You can look at it line by line this way, or drag it downward. So you want to experiment with that a little bit. You don't necessarily need to make this formula bar taller. I think it's better to double-click on the cell, but you certainly have that as an option as well. But it might throw you at first if, after adjusting by using these Alt-Enters as I did here, when you perhaps later you've forgotten about that, you come back and click on this cell, you're a little surprised as you look in the formula bar. That's why, again, I suggest double-clicking in the cell to editing, I think, is the best way, particularly if you have zoomed in. You want this to be big and clear and unambiguous as you view it on the screen when you need to do debugging.